The Second Battle of Tarain has long been framed as a clash between two civilizations, two military traditions, and two temperaments. But at its core, it was a problem of command judgment under pressure. Strip away the romance, the later poetry, and the nationalist myth making, and what remains is a brutally practical question. When faced with a mobile enemy that refuses decisive contact, do you wait and bleed, or do you force the battle at a cost you can calculate? The tragedy of terrain, the tragedy of Tarain lies not in courage or numbers, but in the failure to translate numerical and moral superiority into operational inevitability. Prithviraj Chauhan entered the second encounter at Tarai with advantages that many defeated commanders in history would have killed for. He had numbers, he had homegrown familiarity, he had moral anchored in recent victory, he had an army culturally conditioned to accept close combat, sacrifice, and frontal shock. His enemy, Muhammad Ghori, had been defeated once already by that very combination. Nothing in the strategic environment required Prithviraj to innovate wildly or adopt alien doctrines. He only needed to ensure that his strengths were brought to bear before they were eroded. Yet what unfolded instead was a battle of delay, attrition, and psychological erosion, a contest whose rules favored the side that could trade time for damage, and, and that was not Prithviraj's war to fight. The central error was that ignorance of Ghori's tactics. It is implausible to suggest that Rajput commanders were unaware of mounted archery, fright, feigned withdrawal, or rotational harassment. Those were not secrets of the steppe. They had been seen, described, and fought against across centuries of Indo-Central Asian contact. That the failure was not informational but decisional. Prithviraj appears to have accepted implicitly or explicitly a battle rhythm in which the Ghurid army was allowed to cycle forward, fire, withdraw, and repeat, while the Rajput host absorbed losses without imposing proportional cost. Once that rhythm was accepted, the outcome became a matter of arithmetic rather than valor. Time in warfare is never neutral. Every minute under missile fire degrades moral, cohesion, and physical capacity. Even if casualties are not immediately catastrophic, wounded men leave the line, horses panic or are disabled. Command signals become more harder to transmit through noise, dust, and confusion. A force that is stationary or slow moving under fire pays compounding costs, while a mobile skirmishing force pays mostly linear ones. By choosing to wait for the enemy to tire, Prithviraj inverted the cost structure of the battle. His army, designed for shock and close combat, was asked to endure an attritional context in which advantages were irrelevant and its weaknesses exposed. The alternative was a was not a reckless, mindless charge, as later apologetics sometimes imply. A frontal advance doesn't have to be a single suicidal rush. It can be structured, rotated, layered, and psychologically managed. The essence of the counter is simple. If the enemy's lethality depends on space and time, then deny both. By advancing continuously, even in short controlled increments, the Rajput army could have forced the mounted archers into an accelerating dilemma. Every volley would buy diminishing returns as the distance closed. Every forward movement by the Rajputs would endure the effective arc and reaction time of the archers. Even modest, consistent losses inflicted on the mounted forces would have outside psychological impact, because the entire Ghurid system depended on the perception of safety in withdrawal and rotation. The use of forward screen units drawn from the high-ranking chiefs, but not drawn from the high-ranking chiefs, but from ordinary soldiers led by competent junior officers, fit naturally within Rajput military culture. When properly framed, these men would have been sacrificial in the sense of abandonment. They would be vanguard defenders holding ground for minutes at a time, knowing that the mass of the army was advancing behind them. Their task would be finite, visible, and meaningful. Shields raised, spears braced, javelins hurled at horses, and riders during moments of exposure would absorb the initial storm while the main body advanced in measured bursts. Rotation would prevent collapse, relief would be expected and hoped for. Courage in this context would not be individualistic heroism but coercive endurance, a form of bravery entirely consistent with the Rajput ethos. Psychological Psychology matters more or as much as physics in such encounters. Mounted archers thrive when they feel untouchable. While withdrawal is clean and losses are minimal, the moment that assumption breaks, caution creeps in. A horseman who has seen commanders return wounded or not return at all becomes less willing to press close. Rotations slow, formations bunch, commanders begin to fear overextension. At that point, the dynamic flips. The advancing mass is no longer prey but pressure, an approaching certainty that cannot be reset by another volley. Even if a small percentage of archers are lost in each engagement cycle, the visible reduction in numbers combined with the relentless advance of tens and thousands of men creates a psychological compression that favors decisive action or retreat. Critically, such a strategy doesn't require annihilating the enemy in place. Medieval battles are often decided by the collapse of will rather than the destruction of manpower. Driving the Ghurid force back to its camp, disrupting its logistics, denying the ability to reform would have constituted a decisive victory, militarily and symbolically. Burning the camp would have shattered the narrative of Ghurid invincibility and reinforced Rajput's dominance in the region. The fact that Ghurid or Muhammad Ghori might have returned another year is irrelevant. Wars are not won by hypothetical futures, but by realities imposed in the present. The deeper issue exposed by Tarain is the difference between a warrior's instinct and a commander's obligation. A warrior values honor in the moment, the courage to stand firm, the refusal to yield. A commander must value outcomes over appearances, structures over impulses, systems over single acts of bravery. Waiting under fire may feel disciplined, even dignified, but if it serves the enemy's plan, it is not restraint, it is compliance. Forcing contact, even at a known cost, can be more rational and human choice if it shortens the battle and preserves the army's fighting capacity. Prithviraj's failure then was not cowardice or ignorance, but misaligned judgment. He appears to have trusted that endurance and moral firmness would eventually compel the enemy to consent the fight. Instead, endurance became exhaustion, firmness became rigidity. Ghori, by contrast, understood that adaptation and tempo could compensate for numerical inferiority. He didn't need to win every exchange. He only needed to ensure that time worked against his opponent. In that, he succeeded. History often judges commanders harshly with the benefit of hindsight, but Tarain invites criticism even without it. Given the constraints, the culture, and the resource available, a structured, relentless frontal advance was not only possible but arguably the least bad option. If aligned with Rajput strengths, imposed psychological pressure on the enemy and minimized the prolonged attrition that ultimately proved fatal. This was not attempted decisively in what makes defeat so frustrating to analyze. The loss was not inevitable. It was chosen, moment by moment, by allowing the enemy's preferred battle to unfold. In the end, Tarain stands as a case study in the cost of surrendering initiative. Numbers unused are meaningless. Courage misapplied is wasted. Time granted to the enemy is rarely returned. A commander's duty is not to fight beautifully but to make victory unavoidable. At Tarain, Prithviraj fought bravely, but he didn't make victory inevitable, and history followed the logic of the battlefield rather than the poetry of honor.